All right, thank you, everyone. It is 8 o'clock here in Vancouver. Welcome back to the second panel of the 10th International Conference of the BGHRA. I will be moderating this panel, which promises to be interesting, to be enriching, because of the historical perspective from which we shall be looking at Black Germany in general and beyond. The panel's topic, as we can see in the flyer, is Remembering and Forgetting Colonial Echoes in Black German History. By way of introduction, my name is Ajibola Fabusuyi. I'm a PhD student of Germanic Studies at the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies in UBC Vancouver. I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, Vancouver. Our presenters for this panel are Tawreak J. Gamble-Eddington, who is already here. We also have Sara Pugach and Professor Robbie Akin. Each of them will speak for 15 minutes. And after that, we will go to Q&A. So I would say that for the audience, please kindly type your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. Okay, if we see any question or comment in the chat, we might read it, but we will get better access to the Q&A. Let me go ahead and introduce our presenters. I will start with Tawreak. I hope I get his pronunciation very well.
Yeah, you're good.
Super. So Tawreak J. Gamble-Eddington graduated in 2021 from Union College with honors in history and political science. He is currently completing an MPhil in race, ethnicity, and conflict at Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland, where he is a George J. Mitchell Scholar. Today, Ty will be presenting an excerpt from his honors undergraduate history thesis, which focused on Black experience in interwar Europe. The title of Ty's talk today is Exoticization and Discrimination, Hans-Jürgen's Massaquoi and Black experience in early to mid 20th century Germany. So Ty, you have the floor right now. Thank you.
I go now. I start now? Okay, cool. So relegated to the background in European history, the Black experience in Europe during the interwar period and early stages of World War II has historically not been given the same attention as the experience of other marginalized groups within Europe's borders. From the writings of Tina Kamp and other Germans to the archival work of Clarence Hussein and Hitler's Black victims, however, scholars have increasingly studied the lives of Black people in early to mid 20th century Europe over the past 2 decades. My paper will outline how the Black experience in Germany during the early to mid 20th century was marked by exoticization, discrimination, fear, and forced sterilization as mainstream white German society positioned Black people as the other. This paper will begin by examining a handful of historical events that crafted the perception of the Black community in Germany during the period, and then dive into the life of Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi, a mixed-race German. Drawing on Massaquoi's autobiography, Destined to Witness, this essay will also highlight the unique experiences of mixed-race Germans growing up during the interwar and early World War II period, as they seek to uncover their identity in a rapidly changing country. I'll conclude by exploring one of the chief causes of fear for Massaquoi and others in the Black community during the period: forced sterilization and accusations of interracial mixing. Massaquoi was a mixed-race man born in Hamburg, Germany in 1926 to a white German mother and a Black Liberian father. Prior to the 1950s, Germany was a very homogeneous nation with few Black people within its borders, estimated to be between 5,000 and 25,000 people, with the exception of some foreign diplomats and colonial subjects from Cameroon. Even more rare, however, were mixed-race Germans like Massaquoi, who were viewed as abnormalities in Germany and potential threats to society, often being associated with historical events such as the French occupation of the Rhineland. To those ends, Massaquoi provides a unique perspective as one of the few members of the Black community in Germany during the early to mid-20th century who wrote about their experiences, and as a mixed-race German who endured the Nazi regime. Growing up as the grandson of the Consul General of Liberia in Germany in his youth and living out the latter portions of his life with his mother in a working-class German household, Massaquoi provides insights into growing up as a Black man in Germany in the middle of the 20th century. When reflecting on his life, Massaquoi wrote, "Racists in Nazi Germany did their dirty work openly and brazenly with the full protection, cooperation, and encouragement of the government, which had declared the pollution of Aryan blood with inferior, non-Aryan blood the nation's cardinal sin. I faced the constant threat that the Nazi ethnic cleansing policies posed to my safety alone. I faced this threat without the sense of security and feeling of belonging that humans derive from being members of a group." While growing up in Germany, Massaquoi encountered the racism of the Nazis and the internal dilemma of knowing how to self-identify as a mixed-race person. Massaquoi considered himself German, but was seen as the other by society because of his race. In Nazi Germany, ethnic categories of race could not be crossed. One could be white in German or Black in foreign. The former seemed normal in Germany and the latter exotic, but nothing lay between the two extremes. What then was the context for the German perception of Black people that affected Massaquoi's childhood? As the artillery fire of World War I ceased, with the Allied forces emerging triumphant over the Central Powers, a new European political landscape took form to the detriment of Germany and German pride. Like a fragile glass window, German national pride shattered into 1,000 pieces, and nationalism emerged as a glacier to put the pieces back together. In rebuilding German pride, a tsunami washed over European society as the conditions of peace gave way to the rise of Nazism and the use of minorities as scapegoats. In the backdrop of heightened racial tensions and false perceptions of Black people, the life of Massaquoi highlights the sense of exoticization, fear of persecution, and frequent discrimination encountered by the Black community in Germany during the period. World War I was the first time the French had mass mobilized colonial soldiers from Africa for war in Europe, and in the months after World War I, the presence of Black French soldiers in Europe took center stage. The realization that Black French troops were stationed in occupied Germany lit the match for heightened racism to spread across Europe like a wildfire. The presence of colonial soldiers in the French occupation was a reversal of traditional power roles. Now, the colonial soldiers could exert power over the German populace, who had once been colonial masters. The negative perception of Black people in Germany was heightened in March of 1920 when Moroccan regiments in the French military clashed with German demonstrators, killing 9 people. The combination of the March incident and existing whispers about African soldiers' savagery and their treatment of white German citizens culminated in the Black shame of Germany and rumors of white defilement or the erosion of European civilization. As the days passed, anti-Black sentiments grew, laying the groundwork for the perception and treatment of members of the Black community in Germany that seemed to encompass the earlier portions of Massaquoi's life. Although Massaquoi encountered racist remarks from his earliest memories, his first encounter with being seen as the other came when he went to a zoo exhibit in Hamburg with his mother during elementary school. As part of Hagenbeck's famous culture shows, there were special exhibits of primitive peoples at the Hamburg Zoo. Massaquoi wrote, "After walking past spectacular exhibits of monkeys, giraffes, lions, elephants, and other African wildlife, we arrived at the African village, replete with half a dozen or so thatch roof clay huts and people we were told were authentic Africans, barefoot and dressed in tattered rags." The image of Blacks as primitive and exotic in Germany was a common stereotype, so much so that upon approaching the African village, white visitors of the exhibit pointed at Massaquoi and called him one of the exhibit's kids. Massaquoi's experiences at the zoo and the presence of the African village shows how many Germans perceived Blacks as primitive during the period. The fact of the matter is, however, that many Black Germans had to play the African in human merengues or in the Volkerscha in order to find work during the period. Black individuals' experiences in the early portion of the interwar period were marked by their portrayal as the exotic other in German society. The exoticization and alienation of Blacks from German society, however, did not halt as time progressed. Instead, as the Nazis rose to power in the 1930s, Blacks were increasingly separated from participation in society and persecuted along with other minority groups. For the Nazis, the perceived problem of the mixed-race German population and a growing Black community in Germany took center stage. The Nazis saw the existence of the mixed race and Black population in Germany as a problem of defilement in the German state that needed to be addressed in some manner. To those ends, the Nazis passed a series of laws between 1933 and 1935, such as the Nuremberg race laws that limited the ability of non-Aryans to participate in the public sphere of Germany. Originally designed to persecute the Jews, the Nazi laws also perpetuated the systemic persecution of Black Germans. Some of the laws passed by the Nazis included a prohibition against Jewish or Black farmers, restrictions on non-Aryans' ability to be in civil servants, a ban on intermingling between Aryans and non-Aryans, and the virtual elimination of non-Aryans' ability to receive higher education or attend high school in Germany. In the wake of the passage of the Nuremberg race laws, the educational environment changed dramatically for Black Germans. While many Black students got dismissed immediately from secondary school, Massaquoi was able to continue his education until he finished secondary school, but he too faced racism within the classroom from his peers, teachers, and administrators. Massaquoi encountered biased fitness tests to prove his inferior nature, was pushed into the shadows of school's public performances, and was constantly reminded of his perceived intellectual inferiority as a result of his race and in comparison to his white counterparts. Massaquoi, however, often found himself at the top of his class academically, and despite the dismay of Nazi administrators, regularly outperformed his white German peers in various activities. In another instance, which speaks to the view of many Germans about the Black community during the period, Massaquoi's teacher told him, "There are many ways of being racially inferior. I wouldn't be at all surprised if your Klassenkamerad one day winds up as an antisocial element, such as a criminal or alcoholic, or if he is already susceptible to a host of debilitating diseases." Massaquoi's teacher, after pulling him aside in class, continued, "Let me tell you something, young man. Don't feel so smug, because after we have finished with the Jews, people like you will be next." Massaquoi's racially charged encounter with his teacher was a recurring trend. In a different instance, Massaquoi's principal told him that Hitler would remove treasonous non-Aryans to prevent them from defiling German blood through intermingling and stealing the rewards of Germans' hard work. The tropes about Blacks in Germany as corrupting and inferior human beings present in Massaquoi's education shows the far reach of Nazi racial doctrine in society. Upon the completion of his secondary education, Massaquoi could not attend university because of the Nuremberg race laws, but instead became a mechanist in a local factory. Despite the discrimination that he endured, he found himself influenced by Nazi propaganda, from claiming that he hated Jews because he was a good German and repeatedly attempting to join the Young Volk to collecting figurines of Nazi leaders. Massaquoi admired Germany. Once he reached adulthood, Massaquoi even attempted to join the Nazi military. A possible rationalization for Massaquoi's desire to be a part of German society, in spite of his experiences, could be a desire to obtain some semblance of respect, acceptance, or prestige that he had up until that point been deprived of as a mixed-race person. Additionally, Massaquoi found himself in a constant struggle to understand his identity as a mixed-race German, and accordingly could have seen participation in the systems of his oppression as a means to connect with his heritage. The simplest understanding, nevertheless, is that he wanted to be part of German society because he was immersed in Nazi propaganda. No matter the rationale, a desire to be part of the state appeared as an omnipresent desire of at least some of the mixed-race individuals in Germany during this period. Outside of the classroom as well, Nazis' notion of racial purity took center stage in the lives of members of the Black community and can be seen through Massaquoi's experiences. One of the primary stereotypes used by Germans was that Black men were hypersexual predators or defilers of the German race with questionable masculinity. Massaquoi recalled, "If I entertained any notions of simply ignoring the law, they were countered by chilling accounts I had read, detailing how Jews and other minorities who had been caught committing Rassenschande with German women had paid for their crime with castration or even their lives." As a result of the Nazi laws, Blacks in Germany lived in perpetual fear of being accused of Rassenschande and treated lightly around white German women. Massaquoi recalled in particular an instance while walking home at night when he got detained by Nazi soldiers for loitering and being on the prowl for women. The German conceptualization of the Black man, or the Black community more generally, as a sexual predator defiler of German society did not begin with the Nazis. Instead, its origins date back to German portrayals of Black French soldiers occupying the Rhineland after World War I, which was discussed earlier. Massaquoi's experiences with racism throughout his youth show the discriminatory nature of German society during the period. Massaquoi was, in the eyes of the Nazis, an inferior defiler and an exotic exhibition for white consumption. Although Massaquoi's experiences are telling of the struggles that the Black community in Germany faced, they do not tell the complete story of the Black community in Germany. Massaquoi was able to avoid some of the worst aspects of the period, namely forced sterilization, internment, or death, which hundreds of other members of the Black community did suffer from. As the Black community in Germany underwent racial discrimination, many within the community sought out connections to a greater Black experience that counter the Nazi propaganda of Black inferiority and developed a sense of Black male masculinity that had been stripped from them or positioned as in excess by the Nazis. To those ends, Massaquoi made note of Jesse Owens' 1936 Olympic Games, breaking the German stereotypes of Blacks as primitive beings. Successful Black icons helped Blacks in Germany to feel connected to an international Black experience, providing pride and optimism in a period when Nazi policies constantly undermined their value to society. At the same time, however, Black athletes unable to beat their white counterparts became symbols of Black inferiority to white society and undermined Black masculinity within Germany. The appeal to a larger Black experience counters the omnipresent feeling of inferiority and the questioning of self-identity experienced by mixed-race people. For Massaquoi, according to authors like Plumley, the color of his skin was a symbol of freedom and a liability to his life. This fact was only heightened by the lighter complexion of Massaquoi's skin, which allowed him to pass as African-American, identify himself as mixed race, and differentiate himself from other members of the Black community in Germany. The fate of the Black community in Germany ranged from societal isolation to state-sponsored persecution, sterilization, experimentation, internment, and even murder. The Black community in Germany, however, did not suffer from a systematic program of annihilation. Instead, they were persecuted in secrecy and through the ambiguity of Nazi race laws. A possible explanation for the experience of Blacks in Germany is that they were seen as undesirable, but not as immediate or dangerous threats to German society. As such, with the vast majority of scapegoating being targeted at Jews and Gypsies, the Black community largely escaped systematic persecution because they were viewed as peripheral problems. However, they cannot escape the day-to-day persecution of being deemed as non-Aryan or undesirable. Massaquoi's experiences shed light on how German exoticized and discriminated against their Black community during the period. From racial profiling in public schools to zoo exhibits featuring primitive Africans, Massaquoi encountered the racial undertones of what being the other was like in Germany. In Germany, there truly was a love-hate relationship or fascination with the Black community. Blacks were inferior, primitive, and unsuitable for mating, but simultaneously also the center of German fascination and the system of exotic commodification and obsession with the Black body. Massaquoi's life is a testament to the important role that race plays in casting minorities as the exotic other and the erosion of their rights and the unique experiences of mixed-race individuals to find themselves in a nation that has disowned them and continuously gone down different paths. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ty. That was beautiful. We move now to our next speaker, who is also here. That will be Dr. Sara Pugach. Dr. Pugach is professor of history at California State University. She is the author of the popular Africa in Translation, A History of Colonial Linguistics in Germany and Beyond, 1814 to 1945, which was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2012. Her still recent project was on the experience of African students in the German Democratic Republic. Today, she will be presenting a talk on memories of colonialism in post-war Germany and Cameroon. So, Dr. Pugach, you have the virtual space. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for having me here. Okay, so I'm sort of at right now an odd juncture between research projects. I just finished my book on African students in the GDR. That's going to be out actually in September, also with the University of Michigan Press. And I've only started to gather material on a potential new project. And I say potential because I'm not yet sure exactly what I'll find, or if my hypotheses are correct, or even if I'll go with this project as opposed to another, or if this will just, if this project that I'm going to discuss with you now will be the basis of a book or just of a couple of articles. And with that in mind, that this is less a draft than a meditation, I will begin. So the idea for a project on memories of colonialism in post-war Germany and Cameroon emerged when I was reading through files at the Bundesarchiv, looking for documents related to African students. When looking at files related to specific nations, I made a rather superficial observation. I noticed that there were many more files concerning the GDR's association with Cameroon in the late 1950s and early 1960s than there were for most other African countries in that same era. I also remember that Jeanette Ajibola, who I interviewed in Accra in 2015, was perplexed by why I was in Ghana doing research on African students in the GDR. Why aren't you in Cameroon, she asked, before commenting that much of her cohort, which studied in the GDR in the 1980s, so like different period, had come from there. Ajibola was herself the daughter of a Cameroonian father and an East German mother. She had moved to Accra in the 1990s with her husband, who is Ghanaian. Now, the ties between the GDR and the main opposition party independence movement in Cameroon, which was called the UPC, the fact that they had these ties, well, that wasn't necessarily a strange thing. In the years leading up to Cameroonian decolonization in 1960, the main independence movement in Cameroon, again, this UPC, which was actually Union des Populations du Cameroun, Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, this independence movement, because of the East German doctrine of solidarity with peoples fighting for freedom from European colonialism, the GDR was a staunch defender of independence movements and political parties from throughout the continent, amongst them the South African ANC, the Namibian SWAPO, and the Zimbabwean ZANU and ZAPU. Furthermore, the UPC did espouse certain socialist, Marxist, Pan-African, African socialist ideas. Yeah, as I flipped through these files about the GDR and Cameroon, I still wondered to what extent the especially strong East German interest in Cameroon was related to the colonial past that joined them, and how much Cameroonians were also considering that past with regards to the GDR. So I want to see this from both perspectives, East German and Cameroonian, and actually also possibly, or actually probably also from the West German perspective. I've not started researching that yet. Now, the GDR famously held that the Federal Republic was an imperialist, neo-colonial state that promoted exploitative policies along with its allies, the US, Great Britain, and France. Meanwhile, East Germany was figured as an anti-imperialist partner with states that were emerging from colonial oppression. It is thus not unlikely, though not impossible, that GDR officials would have felt that they had a specific obligation to work with Cameroonian independence leaders or those from other former German colonies, obviously Cameroon having been a former German colony, because of Germany's colonial past. Even so, the memory of that colonial past was likely still embedded in the Cold War East German-Cameroonian relationship on both the East German and Cameroonian sides. And again, also, I think probably in the West German case. Now, in his work on the continuing significance of colonialism in Germany, Jason Verber has commented that Germany, quote, took part in a kind of decolonization without colonies, end quote. This was certainly true for the GDR with respect to Cameroon, where that decolonization was occurring both through memories of the past, as well as in concrete steps to change the direction of decolonization in the present, to change it from sort of direct decolonization in a socialist direction towards the Soviet bloc. Now, on the Cameroonian side, they're obviously also trying to change the direction of decolonization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through the paper. Now, in terms of their interaction with Cameroonians, East German officials often spoke disparagingly, and especially of any Cameroonian who would reference the strong bond that they had with Germany because of their shared colonial history. So in some of the letters and so forth that I've seen between both UPC officials and East Germans and other people in other Cameroonians and East Germans, there were some cases where they would say, you know, well, we're fighting the British and the French, but you know, we know that the Germans were the best colonizers. This was probably just flattery. I think probably was trying to flatter them, but in any case, that comes up in some occasions, and so the East Germans would then become, or the officials when they would write back, to the Cameroonians would say things like, well, you know, Germany was colonial. Well, Germany, our colonial history is not a good one. And fortunately, we here in the GDR have left that behind, and all the imperialists are in West Germany. They would say something like that. That was part of their rhetoric. And they often talked about Cameroonians and other Africans as though they don't understand what they call the Germany question, the difference between East and West Germany. Actually concerned East German officials quite a lot, both in the Cameroonian case and others. But I want to say again that while the East Germans would get into a very paternalistic and condescending mode in these letters and try to educate the Cameroonians about the German colonial past. But again, I think that when Cameroonians were calling on that shared history, they were really more doing so as a means of flattery to cater to German nationalist pride in ways they thought would make East Germans more amenable to helping them and to their position. Further, while there was what's called a Cameroon with a K, so Cameroon spelled K-A-M-E-R-U-N, as opposed to the C that they have in English and French, while there was this Cameroon with a K movement in the Cold War period, the K was highlighted really not out of a belief in the superiority of German colonialism, but as a rebuke instead to English and French colonialism. So Cameroonians were instrumentalizing their past history to procure the support that they needed from the GDR. And they were also trying to procure support from the Federal Republic at the same time. Okay, in this period in the Cold War, many African nations either on the way to decolonization, being decolonized, or already just decolonized, were seeking or not aligned really and seeking aid from both sides of the fence, so to speak, the Soviet bloc and the West. Now, from what I have read so far in these Cold War era documents about the East German Cameroonian relationship, colonial memory comes to the fore in some instances and fades into the background in others. Therefore, it's difficult to read the way that Germans and Cameroonians interacted and approached each other as consistently inflected by colonialism. Nonetheless, a deep dive into the relationship, close reading, as well as into the relationship, again, between the Federal Republic and Cameroon, may reveal important aspects of the process whereby Germans and Cameroonians worked out their understanding of the colonial past, exchanged knowledge about it, and used it to navigate the unfolding of decolonization in their Cold War present. So for the rest of this brief paper, I'm going to sketch the general contours of the East German Cameroonian relationship in the late 1950s and early 1960s. I'm staying in that period right now. That's where I've done the most research so far. So that relationship first began around 1958-1959, with the arrival of Cameroonian students in the GDR and the hosting of two of the UPC's leaders and founders, Felix Mounier and Ernest Ouandier. Together with Abel Kingwe and Ruben Omniobe, Mounier and Ouandier had founded the UPC, the Union of the Populations of Cameroon, in 1948. Their goal was decolonization, a unification of the French and British sectors of Cameroon. Cameroon had been a German colony. After World War I, it was made a French and British mandate. Most of the, under the League of Nations, most of the colony went to the French, but there was part of it that did go to the British. And this actually even, there's some issues related to this, obviously, going on now. But in any case, at that time period, it was a really important issue as well. Okay, so again, their goal was decolonization, unification of the French and British sectors, and the implementation of socialist economic policy. Now, the 1950s and the 1960s were tense and often violent period in Cameroon, as the UPC struggled first with the French colonial government and then also with pro-French Cameroonian political forces. The party, the UPC, Union of the Populations of Cameroon, was banned, and then it was unbanned in the 50s. And when the country finally decolonized and achieved independence in 1960, Amadou Ahidjo, a French ally, became president, okay? And the UPC did not see this as them being a decolonization. They saw it really as a continuation of French rule in Cameroon. So the UPC found itself then in the opposition and continued their fight against neo-colonialism and enduring French control. Many UPC members took the struggle outside of Cameroon as well and moved to nations such as Ghana, Guinea, and the GDR. For those inside the country, persecution and imprisonment were likely, and that made exile not only appealing, but vital. Okay, and even exile did not guarantee safety. Moumié was assassinated in Geneva by French forces in late 1960. So the French were very concerned about, and French forces about the UPC. And in fact, with the exception of Abel Kingwe, who I mentioned before, who had some sort of medical issue and passed away of natural causes, the rest of them were all assassinated, murdered. They were all murdered. Moumié, Ouandié, and Omniobe. So they were seen as very problematic to the French and to the French allies like Ajibola. Okay. So thus, as members of the UPC fled the country looking for safe harbor, the GBR became a center of what was known as the UPC in exile. And I cite a center because it's quite possible that there were more UPC in exile groups in other Soviet bloc nations. The UPC in exile consisted primarily of Cameroonian students who organized the visits of politicians like Moumié and Ouandié and became intimately involved in disseminating information on the struggle in Cameroon. For example, the Cameroonian student Julius Anton Nianse, a core member of the UPC in exile, one of its founding members, I think, had multiple unofficial diplomatic responsibilities. He planned Moumié and Ouandié's stays in the GDR. He also had planned to stay for Abel Kingwe, but he was unable to come because of his health issues. He accompanied Ouandié to confidential meetings with various departments of the East German government, wrote articles about Cameroon for different Socialist Unity Party, SED, right, publications, and apprised SED party functionaries on fissures within UPC leadership. And I'm actually currently writing an article related, not quite related to this project, concerning Nianse and his work in the GDR. Okay. So from the time Nianse and his fellow students arrived in the GDR in 1959, East German relationships with the UPC blossomed. The Free German Trade Union Federation, FDGB, and the National Front of the GDR, the NF, worked especially closely with the Cameroonian opposition. Indeed, the FDGB even became embroiled in the internal politics of Cameroon's independence movement, as East German trade union officials struggled to make sense of the divisions within Cameroon's various unions. Okay. So I know I only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to try to just summarize the rest here. Okay. So again, the GDR was giving a lot of support, material support, financial support to the UPC. They were hosting UPC figures. There were UPC members who were coming to Cameroon as students. So it was a very sort of a very tight relationship. And again, the sort of the most important people in the UPC were coming up to the GDR. Okay. Other things that happened, and this was an image I wanted to show you, was that after Moumié was assassinated in 1960, the German National Front stayed in contact with his wife, Martha Moumié, and they actually planned to publish, let me see if I can find this here. They actually planned to publish his autobiography, or his, not autobiography, her biography of him, excuse me, Dr. Felix Roland Moumié, My Memories of His Life. They were going to do this in the, oh shoot, where's the other image I have here? Okay, here. So that's the cover of the book, and here are the Moumiés. That's Marta, who wrote the biography of her husband, and this is Felix Roland Moumié, who was assassinated in 1961. So they were going to actually publish this book with their the Congress Verlag, which was their in-house publisher. It's unclear whether it actually appeared with them or not, simply because Congress Verlag actually folded or was absorbed into other publishing houses in 1962. Okay, so hold on. Sorry. Okay, so the other things I want to say, and again, a lot of this, right, I'm just at the beginning of this project, so it's very fluid. And so one other thing I just wanted to mention really quickly is that a member of the Bell family, who was also a UPC member, whose name was Thabo Camille, surfaced in the GDR in 1963. And this is really interesting because the Bells, who my colleague Robbie Akin has discussed really extensively and impressively, were an extremely significant Cameroonian family that really made a mark in Imperial Germany. There were Bells who were coming to Germany to study from the late 19th century. It was a wealthy and upper elite family in Cameroon. And some of them intermarried with Germans and had families in Germany. But there's not too much evidence of a continuing Bell presence in post-war Germany. So the fact that Thabo Camille appeared was confounding to the East Germans who met with him. And this was the Union of Journalists, because that was his host. He was a journalist. So I think I've come to the end of my time, so I won't go through the rest of this, but just to say that going forward, I plan to expand this project by exploring different archives, both governmental and non-governmental in Germany and Cameroon. And I also hope to be able to interview at least one Cameroonian who's still alive and was present while all of this was going on in the 60s. So thank you for your patience with this meditation. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about the potential for this topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sara. You might even be able to say more about your ongoing project when all the speakers are finished speaking. So I think we still have some time for that, hopefully.
That's great.
So,
thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Our last speaker, last but not least, of course, is Professor Robbie Akin. Robbie Akin is an historian of Black Europe and Empire at Sheffield Hallam University. He has written widely on the development of a Black community in Germany in the 1880s up to 1945. His publications include Black Germany, the Making and Unmaking of a Diaspora Community, 1884 to 1960, which he co-authored with Eve Rosenhaft. Currently is working on the Black experience of Nazi Germany, as well as post-war compensation claims made by Black victims of the Holocaust. The title of his talk today is The Last Forgotten Victims of National Socialism, Black Germans' Struggle for Recognition and German Colonial Amnesia. So Robbie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and really many thanks to the organizers for what is really a fantastic conference. It's great to already see quite a few connections between our papers. In this paper, I'm going to consider Black German residents of the pre-45 period as forgotten victims of the Nazi terror, a term that has been used to describe a number of victim groups, such as the Sinti and Roma, the disabled, and homosexuals. While there's been belated political and public acknowledgement of the sufferings these latter groups experienced, Black Germans remain almost entirely absent from public and historical memory of the Holocaust. I have previously written in depth about the Nazi anti-Black policy, arguing that particularly from 1939 onwards, we can see a genocidal intent in the Nazis' policies towards Black people. I'm not going to repeat that here. Instead, my focus is on the difficulties that Black Germans had in gaining recognition of their victimhood in the post-war period, specifically in West Germany. This is to provide a part explanation for their invisibility within wider historical narratives. I'll do this by looking at compensation applications made by several Black Germans against the West German state under the terms of a series of compensation laws. These records relate largely to sub-Saharan Africans, primarily, but not exclusively, from Germany's former colonies, some of whom had been resident in Germany from the early 1900s onwards, as well as records pertaining to their German-born children and grandchildren. These materials really are a crucial source of information for numerous reasons. Firstly, there's a real dearth of information on the fate of Black residents during the Nazi period, in part due to the willful destruction of records by the Nazis themselves. So the records help to fill an empirical gap, and they obviously help to complicate our understanding of Nazi racial policy. Perhaps, though, for me, most importantly, in containing personal testimony from Black residents, they provide insight into how post-1945, individually and collectively, they understood their experiences. I can say there are at least 4 legal applications for compensation made by Black German residents, their white partners, their children and grandchildren, and I will draw upon a couple of them in the paper. From the outset, though, I think it's worth stating that around half of the claims were successful, but rarely on first application. Equally, it's clear that dozens of Black residents, including men and women who were sterilized or incarcerated, never registered claims. And I'm happy to speculate on the reasons for that later on. In terms of the compensation laws, in 1949, the constitution of the newly formed West Germany included a commitment to provide compensation for victims of Nazi persecution. A first nationwide law was passed in October 1953, the Federal Supplementary Law, building on legislation already enacted in individual West German states. It's amended in 56 and again in 65, but the original legislation established the principle that compensation could be paid to individuals who'd suffered persecution or abuse on political, religious, or racial grounds. Claims could then be made on the basis of long-term damage to health, imprisonment, death of family members, loss of property or reduction of income, or reduction in opportunities for occupational development, which included the interruption of education. And it's actually under this latter term that most victims will be compensated. So in theory, if we look at the compensation laws, they would appear to offer space for Black victims to apply for compensation on the basis of having been racially persecuted. For those Black Germans who lodged applications, there was no doubt in their minds that the suffering they'd experienced at the hands of the Nazis was on account of Nazi ideas of race. It seemed obvious too to the Jewish and victim support groups which backed their claims that these men, women, and children were victims. Yet proving this to officials that they encountered at claims offices, that they'd been deliberately targeted, specifically on racial grounds, was very far from easy. Such was the elasticity of the Nazi racial policy that very few pieces of legislation specifically referred to those of African heritage. And officials' knowledge, like that of the wider public, of the finer details of Nazi policy, such as the extension of the infamous 1935 Nuremberg race laws to explicitly include Black people, knowledge was extremely limited. So not surprisingly, even less was known about persecution carried out at a local level. All of this clearly impacts on the ability of Black residents to gain acknowledgement for their suffering. So let's briefly take 2 cases. In April of 1951, months after the introduction of a reparations law for West Berlin, Zoya A registered 4 claims for compensation, all on the basis of having been racially persecuted. Zoya was born in Berlin in 1918, the daughter of a Cameroonian man and a white German Jewish woman. In her applications, she testified to having been expelled from school in 1936 on the basis of being non-Aryan. Unable to complete her education, like many Black Germans, she found work as a performer before receiving a ban on performing in public in 1939. In January 1941, months before giving birth to her son with her white German partner, she stated that she was being sought by the Gestapo for the purpose of sterilization. She went into hiding before both she and her son were denounced and discovered by the Gestapo in Prague. Both were incarcerated in the concentration camp Pugach until its liberation in May 1945. So to substantiate her claims, Zoya provided witness statements from her mother, her German partner, medical evidence from several doctors, and proof of having been in Pugach. Despite all of this, within a year, her claims were rejected. The underlying reasons for this related to the way in which her initial caseworker, Herr Scherek, advised Zoya to frame her applications. Unaccustomed to dealing with non-Jewish claimants and unsure as to how best handle her complex case, Zoya complained that Scherek told her to present herself as a victim of anti-Semitic persecution and to foreground her Jewish heritage over her African heritage. So in Sherrick's advice, she argued that because her mother was half Jewish and her father Black, that she counted as a Jew, a clear misunderstanding of Nazi race laws. This then led the authorities to focus on the question of how Jewish she was, starting with the question of how Jewish her mother was. This was adjudged to be unsubstantiated because her mother had been allowed to marry a so-called Aryan during the war. Her claim to have been threatened with sterilization was deemed implausible because the chronology didn't fit in with what was then known about Nazi anti-Jewish policies. Finally, the reason for incarceration in Pankratz was deemed to be non-proven, and in the official's ruling, no attention whatsoever was paid to Zoya's African heritage. So greatly upset by this judgment, Zoya sent a lengthy written appeal in which she made clear that the decision to present her as a Jewish rather than a Black victim had been Sherrick's. And I quote, "Every time I appeared in the office, his colleagues couldn't conceal their amusement. He kept saying, well, I may believe your father is," and here she uses the N-word, "but the high authorities don't have to believe it since they can't see you." So in her appeal, Zoya then sent 5 dated photographs to convince officials of her African heritage. And now she provided a far more detailed description of her experiences. This firmly placed her African heritage at the center of the harassment she and her mother faced. So she testified that this discrimination had already begun in 1933, long before the family knew that her mother was part Jewish. She situated her experiences within a wider context of Nazi anti-Black persecution that she and others she knew of had experienced, something that officials at the claims office were clearly unaware of. So she wrote of the impact of the Nuremberg race laws on those of African heritage, referring to the incarceration of the East African Mohammed Hussein in Sachsenhausen on account of his extramarital affair. And she referred to the forced sterilization of 4 unnamed Black German compatriots. This letter and the photographs resulted in a review of Zoya's case. Now the bureaucrat adjudicating her claims acknowledged that Zoya was without doubt Black, based not on her or her mother's testimony, but above all, based on her appearance. He too questioned aspects of her testimony. It was clear he had little or no knowledge of the existence of a Black resident community during the Third Reich or of Nazi policy towards it. But crucially, he was able to imagine that the Nazis' racial state, being Black, could have impacted on her educational and employment opportunities, and that her relationship with her white partner would have been grounds for a pursuit by the Gestapo. Zoya's claims were therefore deemed credible, and she was offered a one-off payment of 8,000 Deutschmarks, substantially less than the amount Zoya had been hoping for. In relative terms, Zoya's claims can be seen as successful. In contrast, members of the Munich-based Cameroonian German family, Family E, were less successful. In 1957, 4 members of the family, Father Thomas from Cameroon, Mother Marie from Baden-Württemberg, and 2 of their German-born children, Erika and Manfred, launched compensation claims in Munich. Their claims largely related to reduced occupational opportunities. Like Zoya, both children had been unable to secure an apprenticeship upon leaving school on account of being non-Aryan, while Thomas, a performer, claimed that his performance work had largely dried up by the late 1930s and his earnings were greatly reduced. They also referred to further traumatic incidents which didn't fit into the confines of the legislation. So for example, in 1936, all 4 had been photographed by the Racial Research Unit in Munich, with their pictures being put on public display as an example of a so-called degenerate family. 2 years later, Erika and Manfred had been warned by the police from having sexual relations with those deemed to be Aryans. So for the family here too, there was no doubt they had been persecuted on racial grounds, and they too referred to the Nuremberg laws as evidence of Nazi anti-Black policy. The family's claims, however, soon started to unravel. Within months, Marie's application, based on being subjected to public humiliation and emotional suffering as the wife of a Cameroonian man, was rejected. In a 2-sentence response, she was informed that only tangible, not moral claims for compensation were valid. Indeed, the existing legislation provided little room for acknowledgement of the verbal, physical, and psychological abuse suffered by white partners and parents, almost all of whom saw their claims rejected. Like several applicants, the family struggled to trace witnesses or find documentation that could, 1, demonstrate the abuse they had suffered, and 2, link this conclusively to Nazi racial policy. That the claims office was unable to find significant evidence to counter their testimonies was irrelevant. Much as in Zoya's case, officials appear to have been surprised by the claims being made and by the very existence of the people making them. Here, however, in contrast, they showed very little sympathy towards family E and were unwilling or unable to conceive of the family as potential victims. By 65, the family's remaining claims were all rejected on the basis of a lack of evidence and what the claims office saw as inconsistencies and therefore lack of credibility. So the fact that Manfred had been called up to the army in 1944 as part of a general mobilization, and that Thomas had briefly found employment in a 1941 film were seen as clear evidence these people could not be victims. So how should we interpret these cases and others like them? For Zoya A and family E, it was obvious that they were victims of Nazi racial persecution. Explaining and evidencing their experiences, though, within the confines of the reparations legislation was difficult. While the status of Jews as victims of racial persecution was self-evident in terms both of the law and of public and institutional awareness, and while this could easily be demonstrated with reference to Nuremberg laws, this wasn't so easy for other victim groups. Perhaps with this in mind then, it's not surprising that Zoya was advised to present herself as a Jewish rather than a Black victim. Black Germans' claims faltered on account of a combination of ignorance of Nazi racial policy and in prejudice on part of the responsible officials. Success was then dependent upon whether the official was able or willing to imagine a scenario in which being Black could have led to persecution. At the same time, though, and linked to this, recurring in the compensation records, is a real sense of surprise amongst administrators at Black Germans' very existence. So in order to defend the rights they had, Black Germans had to first explain who they were, where they came from, and what they were doing in Nazi Germany to unknowing officials. This hints, perhaps, at the onset of what numerous historians have termed German colonial amnesia, or perhaps better, as Britta Schilling has suggested, colonial aphasia, a collective forgetting or an inability to discuss Germany's colonial past, a continuing consequence of which has been the disremembering or forgetting that Germany ever had a Black population, which stemmed from the colonies and which clearly greatly suffered under the Nazis. Thank you.
Wow. Such a beautiful exposition of this historical past of Germany from Prof. So just to reiterate that you can put your questions under Q&A for the members of the audience, where it will be much easier to read because there will be a plethora of, typing on the chat. So it might not be easy to get questions exactly and save them from other conversations. So let me start my comment questions by a few that I have put down. I will start with Thai. I have also gone through Massaquoi's Destined to Witness. I've not finished reading it. But here, Massaquoi says that, he was referring to the time that he was still young and the father was still in Germany. And he was saying that people indeed deferred to the young him, and his father in public, on the streets, in restaurants and all. And a situation which to me, which actually changes as soon as he starts living with his mother, who is, like a lower middle class person at the time. So this seems to conflict the class or social location, and race as sources or levels of discrimination in Germany during the National Socialist period. What does your study reveal about this question? is it about social class or race or a combination of other, elements even?
I'd say it's probably pretty intersectional. In the initial part of his life, he does grow up as the grandson of the Consul General of Liberia, so he does come from a fairly privileged background. And so in his youth, he does enjoy the privileges of obviously having a grandfather who's very politically influential and having people around him who do tend to pamper him. But when you kind of take out that aspect and he becomes middle class, lower income, which a vast majority of kind of the Black immigrants in Germany at the point were, many of them were Cameroonian migrants who became stateless people after the dissolution of the colony in Cameroon, and the rest of them, many were just kind of economic migrants. And so you have kind of, in general, the Black experience in the period where a lot of middle class at best, but often lower income Black people. And that obviously intersects with the opportunities they have, with the amount that society looks at them. And so you see that, at least from my readings and from my research, that there's a lot of perception around them, mostly in regards to the race. So most of it is in regards to race, but there also is kind of an economic undertone. And as you can see, obviously from the beginning of his life, there is a certain privilege that comes with having that political and economic power. But when you kind of take that away, it does really boil down, I think, mostly to race in a lot of senses. It boils down to kind of this conceptualization of what is a Black person. And it really dates back, especially in terms of Germany, to really the French occupation of the Rhineland, right? And you have this perception of these colonial attitudes of what are Black people? They're primitive, they're savage, they're aggressive. And you have a lot of these ideas flowing around, not only in Germany, also abroad. The UK is a very big embracer of this logic, and so is even the Papal States. During the time, you have the Pope coming out and saying the same thing in terms of the French occupation of the Rhineland. And so a lot of it is not really in regards to the race. Not really in regards to the class. They're not as focused on, are these people low income or upper income? That certainly gives you certain privileges, but it's really focused around, are you not white? And in particular, you're not a white German, and are you Black? And if you are Black, what does that mean? Because this is, at this time, a pretty insular society, with the exception of like a handful of a Black population in the country during the time period. It's not kind of like modern Germany in terms of the diversity or the amount of kind of immigrants or migrants within it.
Thank you, Ty. Let me look at the Q&A right now. This question is for Professor Akin. He's talking about saying this lapse of history about Black Germans and their treatment by the Nazis. It seems not to be very well published. Why do you think this is the case still? Or is that not so?
Yeah, I think that's it's a great question. I do think people have worked on it for quite some time, particularly Black German activists and academics such as Katharina Orban-Toyer. But one of the biggest stumbling blocks that any historian will find is the sheer lack of archival information, particularly for the crucial period from 1940 to 1945. That's why I think these compensations claims records open up new opportunities to find out what happened to many of the Black German victims. But in order to find reparations records, one, people need to have made reparations records. Two, you need to know names, dates. Three, they need to be accessible. I think much of what's been written about this time period is blurred by red herrings such as the Deutsche Afrika-Schau or the German colonial films, which to a degree offer protection to Black people. But the Africa Show shuts down in 1940. The colonial films are made until about 1943. So there's a crucial time gap in which sheer empirical evidence is missing. Clearly, there's other reasons as to why not much has been written, to do with structures of perhaps the way in which history is carried out, to do with the immensity and scope of the Holocaust, to do with this colonial amnesia. There's multiple reasons, I think, as to why this is the case, but I would say that we've seen over the last few years, a bit like Hans Massaquoi's memoir, Tirawonia Michael has written about his experiences, Gatschram, Marina Ya. There are more and more stories out there to try and make this history accessible.
That is true. I hope that such stories will be rendered credible enough, considering that, they're autobiographical nonfiction. Nevertheless, how things are hard to prove with the authorities in Germany. One can already think about, what obstacles may be on the way. But there seems to be another question here. I don't know whom this is directed to, but it says, would you say that this colonial amnesia is a deliberate orchestrated attempt at not recognizing what was done and being held accountable for it by erasing the historical framework to understand this contemporary issue? It seems to link to the initial question, but I don't know who it's directed to. I suppose to you, Professor Aitken.
Is it deliberately constructed? I wonder if the continuation of colonial amnesia is much more deliberate than the actual onset in the first place. I do think that the immensity of the Holocaust made it very difficult for Germans to mentally engage with this colonial past. And I think that's one of the reasons in which it started to, I mean, it's not amnesia. I don't like that, because the colonial past is still around everywhere post 1945, in statues and street names, in colonial racist imagery, in films that are made post 45. But I think just the kind of that sheer mental burden of the Holocaust made it very difficult for people to try and engage with it. I do think, though, more recently, when I think of my experiences of trying to carry out research in the beginning, so 20, 25 years ago, I would be confronted with a lot of archives who would just simply dismiss any notion that there could have been an historical Black presence in Germany. And to my mind, that perhaps speaks to a more ignorant stroke deliberate strategy of trying to hinder opening up these difficult discussions. I still think it's a case in Germany at the present moment that there's many institutions, museums, archives that should know better, that don't want to engage with this topic because they are fearful of what they might confront in terms of their own past. So I'm not sure that it was deliberately engineered to begin with. I think, however, the continuation of it is much more of a political process and a strategic process.
Interesting.
May I say something? Just, I'm sorry, I don't want to. I also think, I mean, in the case of the GDR, it's very deliberate. It's part of their general sort of policy of shunting everything that relates to fascism, Nazism, Holocaust over onto the West Germans. So for them, it's something very specific. But there are still these, again, not even just echoes, but there are definitely references to the colonial past. I mean, the story of Thabo Camille was pretty. They were really kind of confused by it, and they actually ultimately decided, oh, he has to be lying. So they're definitely uncomfortable with this. So, yeah.
Interesting. And my next question goes to you, Sara. So some historical accounts of post-colonial memory of Germany often read like attempts, at diffusing or discrediting the extent of German colonial past, while many simply trace sources of such involvement to private family memories, which with more emphasis on heroic deeds of the actors of massacres, and generally using inconsistencies of personal memories to downplay colonial guilt. Example is Schilling, publication 2014. So in what ways does history, generally provide for counter-argument against such tendencies? I guess it's a wide, kind of question, but.
Okay, you mean against tendencies to?
Yeah.
Could you rephrase against tendencies?
Yes.
Toward, I mean, I understand, but it's yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, to discredit or diffuse the extent of German, involvement yes. in massacres and other, ills of the colonial past, because this, because of the claim, I mean, that these are personal memories, family pictures, photos, and stuff, but in many cases, these are things that people have.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. So what? Why they're sort of claim? Yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry. Why they're not discussing the talk about the massacres, or they're not talking about German responsibility and the German guilt in terms of their role in places like obviously the Herero genocide, Maji Maji, and the brutality in which they treated Cameroonians. You mean other scholars, or just in the GDR, or how do you? I can't hear. I'm sorry. You're muted. You're muted.
Yes, sorry. Particularly about the, the massacres, the Maji of.
Right. In what I've looked at so far in terms of archival evidence relating to the GDR, and this has to do with African students as well, there's pretty much nothing. There are Africans, no, I should say that there are Africans who will bring that up, right? This is from the research on African students. There is this fear in the very early period, like in the early 50s, there's a group of Nigerians who come to the GDR. There is this fear that they won't understand that this GDR is different. That comes up all the time. They won't understand, Africans won't understand that the GDR is different. For instance, when these Nigerians are first in the country, they're saying, well, some of them are very cool towards us. They're very standoffish. Oh, they don't understand that we're no longer connected to any of that. So it is this attempt, again, also to sort of displace any sort of burden or guilt, not only for the Holocaust, but also for other colonial massacres. They don't refer to them directly, but there's definitely this idea that they need to understand that we are different in the GDR, even though that was always undermined by the fact that the students constantly encountered racism. So that, I guess that would be how I would answer the question. Sorry, I don't think I'm being very clear. Apologize.
Thank you. There seems to be a lot of, let me take a look at the, there is a, there's a message that to Robbie that's really scandalous and needs to be changed. I agree. Again, back to Robbie, this is even personal for me, your topic attempt, your topic addresses the same question that was bothering my mind during my first trip to the former concentration camp in Buchenwald in Germany. That made me pose the question to a tour guide on whether, apart from members of the Jewish community and others, other people who were ordered at the time of, the Nazi situation in Germany, Africans were also kept in Nazi camps during during World War II, particularly. And considering National Socialist censorship of cultural materials at the time, where does one go to obtain data on Black Germans and indeed people of African origin in general who were also victims? Where else does one go to?
That is a great question. This is why I'm still doing this after 20 years. Where do you go to? Where do you find information? One of the questions before was about colonial amnesia. I used to be a tour guide at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp when I started this research. And I knew that 5 Black men had been incarcerated in Sachsenhausen, including Mohammed Hussein. And I constantly asked the owner or the people who ran the memorial site, do you have any information? Why is there nothing for the public here? And at that time, I hesitate to say this, they quite simply weren't interested. That was about 20 years ago. And I think that it's taken a lot of these memorial sites a bit of time to try and move beyond the kind of stories that their museums have been telling. A lack of archival repositories is clearly a difficulty. One of the things that changed opportunities for me was the opening up of the ITS Red Cross Bad Arolsen archives. But the biggest difficulty you face is if you do not know names of people, it's very difficult to simply stumble across Black victims. If you have names of people such as people who are resident in Germany over a long period of time, then you can start to trace them further. So most archives are not in any way set up for people to simply stumble across Black victims or certain victim groups. And that is a real issue. But that's also why I think the compensation claims are also slightly a game changer, because they do have the Black voice for the first time, because people have to write a personal testimony under how they experienced the period. Often they'll call upon witnesses who might be other Black Germans, which then offers up opportunities to finding more documentation. And I think, to my mind, that is the way ahead. But because of data protection, sometimes archives are not accessible, sometimes files are not accessible. I think there's still an awful lot for us to learn about the Black experience of Nazi Germany, and particularly of the crucial period 40s to 45. And not just about Black German residents. It's clear to me that people in Austria and Luxembourg who are also of African descent are also being targeted. And once the Nazi Reich expanded to occupied Europe, it's quite clear that other Black people become caught in the Nazis' web. So I think the scale of victims is far bigger than one might previously have estimated. So it's a work in progress, I'm afraid to say.
I agree, it's a work in progress. There is also an important question here. Oh yeah, there is a question. Okay, Sara wants to give a perspective to this question.
No, the only thing I wanted to say is that in looking at, again, I've mainly been working in archives related to the GDR, but they really want to reach out to African countries pretty much almost right away, like pretty much right after the GDR forms. They're reaching out first to these Nigerians, and they're really wanting to bring African students into the country. Now that has a lot to do with Cold War competition, and a lot to do with also specifically the competition between the GDR and the Federal Republic. But that it happens so early might, I don't know, be an indication of some sort of recognition of the past. I don't know though. It's just sort of a hypothesis, or it might just be tied up with Cold War politics. It's kind of hard to know. So, yeah.
Yeah, Robbie, you wanted to. Your hand.
I want to say, Ty, I really liked your paper. I wonder if you could tell us what comes next. You've given us this great presentation on Massaquoi. So, does this fit into a wider project?
Yeah. So, this is an abstract, it's a small portion of a larger chapter of a larger project. So this comes from my chapter on Germany about the interwar period, about the Black experience of Germany in the interwar period, which is a comparative analysis of the life of Michael Theodore and Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi, which comes from a larger project, which was my thesis, which is a comparative analysis of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, looking at autobiographies and personal accounts and documents, looking at kind of the differences and also the similarities in terms of the Black experience as experienced in those countries during those periods, which I found to be pretty enlightening. Not necessarily sure what comes after it. I focus primarily on democracies and human rights abuses, in particular in terms of socio-legal kind of persecution by the state. And so I certainly may continue with the topics of Nazi Germany or whatnot, but I'm not sure exactly. But that's the general realm I've been working in and plan to keep working in. But yeah.
Yes.
That sounds great. And I think that comparative analysis is what's really important. And I think that's part of the way forward for Black European studies.
Certainly. There's a question here. They're asking about the gender contours and dimensions of your talks generally, and whether each of you could speak to the role of gender in your work and how that impacts the historical record or personal experiences. For example, in Robbie's case, the claims made to the West German government.
I can certainly say briefly, when we think about the experiences of the white German wives, they are almost entirely dismissed by the claims authorities. Firstly, they do not believe that the experiences in any way fit in with the legislation, which is why the comments made, this is not about moral or emotional experiences. There's got to be tangible things that can be pointed to. And that makes it very difficult, I think, for white German wives or mothers to frame the narrative that they want to bring in. I think we can also see, however, that kind of sexualization that Tai spoke a little bit about Black German men, we can see it of Black German women. I can think particularly of Marta Ndumbe, who was criminalized because she fell into prostitution. That was the only ways of making a living. And because of that, she was then dismissed post-45 as an asocial. So it was almost a blanket refusal to provide any compensation to anyone whose lifestyle was deemed to be asocial. That was still seen as criminal behavior post-45 as it had been pre-45. So there are clear gender aspects that impact upon the potential success of a claim being made.
Interesting. I was myself thinking about the situation of the wives, particularly of the GIs during that period of where babies had to give their babies up for adoption and all this. Seems, yeah, there are talks and papers and publications about that, but maybe not particularly focused on these cohorts, those white German women. And I think there should be more talk and more publications on that generally. So there is a question here. Excuse me.
If I might just add something.
Yes, fine.
I was just going to say, I think in terms of kind of the experience in the interwar period, more generally, I think a lot of the experience of Black people, and in particular their perception, is kind of geared around gender and gendered kind of terms of normativity. And so in particular for demographics, which Robbie talks about in his book, Black Germans, a lot of the demographic imbalances between men and women leads to more interracial mixing, or more looking for kind of the interracial thing. And kind of the mixed race population in Germany is a big catalyst for why the Germans, the Nazis in particular, want to actually look at the problem of Black Germans because of this growing mixed race population. So I say that's one way. And another way is also just the way in which white mainstream European society looks at Africans, usually is in sexual gender terms. So it is always about kind of the hypermasculinity of the Black man in terms of being aggressive, but also that, so it's the idea of kind of gender in excess. They're too masculine, they're too this, but also at the same time, on the other side, they're feminine enough where they can be dominated, or they're feminine enough where they can do this. And so there's kind of this duality in terms of gender notions, in terms of how you view, in particular, the Black man, but also the Black woman. I would say that's increasingly, if anyone's interested, if you look at France during the period, kind of the movement of necrophilia and the fascination with Black women and kind of the fascination with their bodies and the way it moves and whatnot. And so there's really kind of like a gendered undertone in terms of the way that white society in Europe in particular looks at the Black body during the time period.
Yeah, interesting. There seems to be, hold on. Yeah, somebody added that hypermasculinity of the Black man and hypersexuality or undesirability of the Black woman too. Yeah, interesting perspective to this very important topic. Yes, Sarah.
I agree wholeheartedly with that observation. So I'll speak about this more from my previous project. There were not a lot of African women who came to the GDR. It was about 10% of the student population. There were, however, in terms of the African men, many African men. It's hard to actually quantify, but I would say the majority do have relationships with at least one East German woman. There are marriages, there are children born. And these are actually all really reported on, right? Both by the Stasi And in all the student files relating to these African men, there are often things like, oh, well, he's gone out with blah, 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 or had children with, there's a lot of that discourse around actually the idea of these hyper-masculine, oversexed African men and these wanton and promiscuous East German women. So there's a lot of that. In terms of African women, though, I do think there is this undesirability actually factor, or they are rarely discussed in explicitly sexual terms. They are more discussed, however, and this is true for African men as well, in terms of the need to discipline themselves because they're considered to be unruly, they go out of bounds. There's a story of one woman who gets thrown off a train, and there's this this like idea of why is she thrown off? Was she, how is she treating the conductor? How is he treating her? How did the transportation police, whatever it is, security guards in the train station treat her? There are other stories, again, and African women are always being sort of told to sort of comport themselves. And again, there's not a lot of African women. One other interesting thing, and this just relates to my next project, and I'm not sure exactly how to think about it yet, but now, of course, most of these UPC officials were men, right, who were going and who became students, who visited and who had contact with the GDR. However, both Martha Mumier, again, who writes this biography of her husband to be published in the GDR specifically, or by GDR Press, and Martha Ouandier, Ernest Ouandier's wife, have these relationships to the GDR. So Martha Ouandier also appears in the GDR, and she actually, they want her actually to go and to school there, and the GDR actually denies this, which is kind of surprising because they, in situations like this where someone was prominent, it would make sense, it would have made sense, it would have seemed, to let them study there. But in general, African men who wanted to bring their spouses, or the spouses of African men who wanted from Africa, from their countries, their home countries, who wanted to study in the GDR, were usually denied. They didn't want to have families coming to the country. They didn't want to have to support them because they knew they had to give them family housing. Housing was in short supply, so they were very, very loath to bring any woman who was married to one of the African students or so forth up to East Germany. In the case of Martha Ouandier, it might be partially because as you go along and through into the later 1960s, the GDR, the UPC very much goes underground. It's by the beginning of the 70s, it's pretty underground, but also the GDR begins to shift their focus away from the UPC because they think they see it as a failed independence movement. And so they feel that they need to partner more with, even though the Ahijo regime is very much not at all, they're politically similar, or isn't on, anyway, whatever, they still try to partner with the Ahijo regime from the later 1960s. So that might be one reason why she was rejected, her application to study was rejected. But anyway, so that's it.
Interesting. And Robbie, could you maybe share with us your current or future projects generally, or direct us to where we should look at in generally discussing the experience of Black Germans from the historical point of view?
Yeah, certainly. What my next projects? Well, a lot depends on my teaching loads, but enough of that. I've been sitting on these reparations files for roughly about 6-7 years because I think perhaps lacked the courage to actually start writing on them. But I think this will be the year when I think I do have to sit down and think through what it means in terms of perhaps shifting our understanding of Nazi racial policy towards Black people. It's not systematic, but it's clearly understood at a local level that Black people should be excluded from local communities. And to look at that process of trying to determine your victimhood post-1945, how do people rebuild lives? So that's the big project I'm working on. The other thing that I'm interested in is on Black people in Austria. the kind of digitalization of historical newspapers is a gift to historians. I spent about 6 months going through as many historical Austrian newspapers as I could find to see what did it mean to be Black in Austria? What kind of population are we talking about? How big, small is it? Can we make any similarities between people in Germany or France and Britain and Austria? And I think in many ways we can. So I've written something briefly on a Liberian man who lived in Vienna. And when he died in 1937, 7 newspapers brought news of his death, which would have been unthinkable in a German context. So I tried to trace his life story. Those are the 2 big things. I'm very keen on that kind of knowledge transfer and exchange. So I'm working on memorial projects with some groups in Berlin, not just Stolperstein, but kind of one of the people I'm interested in is Joseph Billet, a Black German communist who was on the stage with Paul Robeson, with Josephine Baker, who was in Moscow with Jomo Kenyatta. So really an amazing figure. And I'm hoping that finally this April, after several years, he is going to get a Gedenktafel, so like a plaque in front of his house to mark just this incredible history that he was involved in. In terms of looking for material, look at Theodor Michael's book, look at Hans Massaquoi, Marina Jahr, Gerd Schramm. Then I would always say, look at Katharina Augentreuer's book, because she opened my eyes to a history that I knew absolutely nothing about. And had I not read her book, I certainly wouldn't be speaking to all of you today. So those would be my starting points.
Thanks a lot. This question might be directed towards Ty and maybe also to Sara. It's just been over my head generally thinking about the fact that I think Ty talked about it, mentioned it in passing in his presentation, that is part of being accepted, as a member of German society for a racialized minority, not only Black, is being excellent in whatever you do, in academics, in sports, and not necessarily being yourself. So how does this situation complicate, particularly for Black Germans, the dual identity that they want to have? Generally, Black Germans want to be seen as Black, as African, and as Germans. But generally, if things happen and they don't, as you said, they are not excellent, so to say, in quotes, in things they do, people seem to withdraw into their ethnic and racial identification generally. If you remember the situation with, well, it's not Black now, but it's, I'm talking about the former footballer in Bundesliga. I forget his name now. I think he's from a Turkish origin, who decided not to play for the German football club anymore because I can't remember, I missed a penalty or so. So generally, I'm asking, how does this complicate the dual identity generally, with which people want to be known for, particularly members of, minoritized communities in Germany? Thank you.
I can start. I would say, so I can't speak for all of them. The 2 cases I really looked at were Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi and Theodor Michael. And Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi is obviously a mixed race person. He doesn't identify as African. He only identifies as German. And he doesn't really even identify with his race as far as what society imposes on him. A lot of the time, he just sees himself as German. And the only association he really talks about in terms of his race is trying to find some type of figure beyond Germany who he can look up to. Oftentimes those being athletes or singers, etc. And so I think in particular for mixed race Germans during this period, it is kind of like a tugging between what are you, right? Because you're born in German, all Massaquoi speaks is German, all these different known as Germany, but at the same time, Germany is telling him, you're not German, like you're African, you're something else. And so a lot of his is kind of like this internal struggle. And you see kind of throughout his memoir also kind of this almost dismay that his mother has in terms of what's going on with her son, because he's playing with Nazi figurines and he's saying that he wants to go join the Young Volk. And his mother's like, I don't understand what's going on here, because this child who's obviously being discriminated against really wherever he goes, especially after the Nazis take power, is kind of idealizing the Nazi state because that's what he's taught. He sees all the other kids who want to join the Nazi party, his way of kind of becoming German in essence. And so you do see kind of this duality, in particular with Massaquoi, but also with other characters like Theodore Michael. He also shows kind of a similar desire to kind of want to join the state, even though he doesn't he's not necessarily desired by the state because he's Black. And so I know for those two examples, at least, there is kind of like that perpetual desire. And I think a lot of that comes, one, from Nazi indoctrination, right? These kids grew up in Germany, it's all they know. And so they grew up during the Nazi era, surrounded by Nazi propaganda. All the kids their age are joining the Nazi party. And then I would say, two, it's a sense of belonging. There's no real community there. For Theodore Michael, it's a bit different. He did have a African diasporic community, in particular because he was part of the Human Merengues. His father was with him for the earlier portion of his life. But for Massaquoi, he really doesn't know anyone. All he has is his white mother, and he has his friends at school. And so I think it's kind of this duality of trying to belong in a society that doesn't want you, but also trying to find yourself in a society that's trying to define you. But I'm not sure if that experience necessarily is applicable to general members of the African diaspora who are in Germany, right? That desire to want to be part of the Nazi state. I would likely say, and I mean, this isn't obviously definite, I likely say would be a bit fainter. There wouldn't be as much of a desire to want to be part of kind of a genocidal state. But that's just an opinion.
Just for the later period, most of the people who I'm looking at are actually, again, African students. So I haven't really done too much research on, or I haven't written about their children and the Afro-German children that they had. But from the people I have spoken with, it's really a very, the experiences are very diverse. I mentioned at the beginning, there's this woman, Jeanette Ariaboy, who's half Cameroonian and half German, and lives now in Accra in Ghana. And she was a really, she was great, really great, and really had a really good, interesting discussion. She had very negative memories of wanting of the GDR and didn't really want to be there. She's a really unusual case because she was born there and remembers East Germany when she was a kid. She was born in like the early to mid 60s. And she has this experience where people are especially taunting her mother because her father goes back to Cameroon and the East German state has not yet decided to allow them to go, right? Her and her brother, her brother and her mom. They don't end up going, I think he goes in like 63 or 64, 65, I'm not sure what year, but they don't go until 1970. So the mom her mom's always being, made fun of and taunted on the street and things like this. And so she didn't actually, then she moved to Cameroon. She doesn't want to go back, but her dad actually, this is really interesting, he insists she goes back. He loved the GDR because it got him out of a really dangerous situation, right? I mean, if you were a UPC member in Cameroon after independence, your life was actually threatened, right? So he left. He first went to Accra. He was in Ghana himself, and then he got the scholarship to go to the GDR. So she said she thought her father just tolerated the racism as part of, okay, this is part of the deal, right? That's what she said. And so it's a really sort of fascinating perspective, but she felt very uncomfortable in the GDR. She did go to school there. She got her she's a doctor, so she got her medical degree there, and she met her husband there, who is Ghanaian. That's why she lives in Accra. And the two of them had enough experiences with racism that after they had their two kids, they finally decided to move back to Accra because they thought that they were just not being accepted within the community. And that really contrasts with experience of I spoke with another woman who's also Afro-German, but she lives in Berlin, named Yvonne Kalagbodi. Her father was one of the first Nigerian students first African students in general in the GDR, Mairu Kalagbodi. She's a little older, so they were there in the 50s and into the early 60s, and then they went back to Nigeria. And again, then she went and moved to first the GDR, and then she continued to live in Germany after reunification. So did her brother. And she says, oh, I don't have any problems at all. Everybody's always been incredibly kind, I don't have any problems, right? or if she did, very few. She didn't mention any. And so they're kind of two groups. There are people who will tell me about all the problems they actually countered in the GDR, actually, and also in the 1990s in post-reunification Germany. And then there are people, this woman was not the only one, who would say, oh, no, it was fine. There was this other man I met in Accra, Robert Kwanzaa, who told me the same thing. Of course, he also then told me that there were all these stories about, Africans being like pushed, held onto train tracks by, neo-Nazis. I mean, he was like, oh no, it's fine. But then he would tell me these stories, which was very odd. So it's a really, these experiences I think are very, very diverse, or at least in terms of what people want to or will tell you. So.
Yeah.
So just to add one more note, I forgot to say, you had mentioned kind of like them wanting to excel in the case of Massaquoi. That was actually probably fairly detrimental to his health in many regards. His kind of desire to still want to be individual and to want to excel is kind of what put him at risk the most when he was in school. And it's what actually made him kind of a very large target by not only his teachers, but also Nazi administrators. And I would say in general that the consensus from a lot of the autobiographies I've read was to lay low, but Massaquoi just simply did not listen to that advice when he was in school. And he was very much so kind of, I'm going to excel even if they don't want me to. But oftentimes even like his desire to excel was hindered by the fact that the Nazis would just cheat, right? So if you're having a race, they'll just say, everyone else run and you can't go yet. And then they'd be like, see, we won. Right. And so what for Massaquoi, the kind of the inability for him to succeed, even though he was better than his peers or et cetera, was very frustrating to him. And also that's why he really looked to kind of these international icons like Jesse Owens and like other athletes who he was saying these people are undoubtedly beating their enemies who happen to be white. And this is proof that like we are not inferior. Like I could do what I want to do and still be successful, do what I want to do. And it's not a sign of kind of my inferiority just because of my race. But yeah.
Exactly. Thank you, Ty, for that. Yeah, there is this again question, which it says, how does being Black in America differ from being Black in Germany as far as dual identity is concerned? Essentially, all African Americans are of mixed race. Who can take that? Robbie, maybe?
I think certainly when I looked at African-American journalists who went to Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and what they had to say about life in Germany and what they had to say about Black Germans. And while they tended to report upon Black Germans and kind of as inspirational figures who were stars of film or who'd been war veterans, actually, I don't think they really understood the day-to-day problems that Black Germans faced. The rise of the Nazis, day-to-day persecution, racism. Instead, I think they came with their own experiences of race in the South of the United States. And for that was for them so much more bigger, so much more important, more threatening than anything that they could see that Black people in Germany were encountering. And I think to a degree, there was kind of almost a misunderstanding. Black Germans were hoping that these newspaper reporters could tell the world about how difficult their life was. Instead, they're being portrayed as success stories in order to contrast Germany, which is seen as the worst of the worst, with the United States, which is then being deemed to be even worse than the worst of the worst. So I think in some ways there's almost it's not quite a miscommunication, but I felt that the Black African-American journalists were instrumentalizing the stories about Black Germans for their own purposes. So I'm not sure that entirely answers the question, but from my perspective, I thought that was interesting to see that just simply because people are Black doesn't mean that they naturally have any kind of connection. And it did feel in this circumstance that connection was being missed.
I'll just say,
yep,
this one story, it's just one story, but that again, Jeanette Ariaboy's husband, Desmond Ariaboy, he actually was approached around 1989, 1990 by a group of white East German men who asked him whether he was African or African American. And when he told them he was African, they got really upset. They said, "We're perfectly fine with African Americans because the U.S. is the one that's bringing an end to this horrible whatever period in the GDR." But if you're an African, you're taking away our that whole rhetoric, right? That whole old whatever, you're taking jobs and education places and so forth away from us. So and this was a very frightening moment for him because he was then beaten up by these guys. There was, at least at that time in the GDR, a perception of difference between Africans and African Americans in at least in East Germany. And just in terms of post-war Germany in general, I would say to look at literature by people like Heide Fehrenbach and Maria Hohn, who've written on this experience of Black GIs in Germany, in this case in Western Germany mainly, and that they found it as a very actually liberating experience compared to the experiences that they had in the United States, so especially in the South.
Sorry if I could just add that's exactly what I wanted to say, Sarah, about what it was like in the 20s and 30s when these African-American journalists came over. It was a liberating experience. They could talk to white women. They could go into hotels and restaurants. The racial abuse that they received was normally from white Americans and not from white Germans. And from that perspective, I think they couldn't really understand what Black German residents had to complain about. But they're only coming for 2-3 weeks and then moving on to the next stop, and they're not living the lives that Black German residents are living, which were becoming, by 29-30, increasingly precarious. So I think that's what led to this almost a lack of empathy in many ways.
If I can add on, I would agree completely. I would also say, if you're interested in it, if you look at articles from the Chicago Defender during the period, you'll find a very interesting kind of dialogue. And part of it, I think, is also politically motivated, right? It was for the benefit of African Americans who were fighting for civil rights to say, well, look how great France is, look how great Germany is in comparison to the US. And so there was certainly kind of this periodic perspective in terms of they're only there for a short period and they're treated better, but also in terms of it's politically relevant for us to kind of describe it this way. But adding kind of like another layer to the question, I think the experience in particular for mixed race people in the two countries is probably quite different. Although the majority of African Americans are mixed race, most African Americans do not identify as mixed race, they just identify as Black. And so in particular, when you're talking about mixed race people in Germany, oftentimes, at least in my period, they're usually half Black, half white. And they identify heavily with both sides, or they identify heavily just with their mother country, that being Germany. And so there is kind of a different perspective in terms of a sense of desiring to belong, in terms of kind of what does that look like, kind of depends on the person, depends on the community.
Thank you, Ty. And to get more perspectives and work on post-war Germany, there have been some posts on the chat section here. Documentary Schwarz Deutsch is on YouTube. There is, Black German by Sonia Michael is here. You can click it. It will take you to the, click the link. And also, very importantly, there is, for other people who are interested in Black presence in the Mauthausen concentration camp, we have a Ziegler lecture soon in UBC. The link is also posted here on the chat section. There are other works that are also put here, Bridgman wrote on the Herero experience, the revolt of the Hereros. It was published by the University of California Press, 1981, and so. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next panel is going to start in the next 16 minutes. So I want to use this opportunity to thank everyone. Ty, thank you for coming. Sara, and thank you, Robbie, for providing perspective and your knowledge. We have been richly enriched, blessed with your papers, and we'll look forward to more collaborations with you in future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.